Mark Wahlberg kicked off The View. After fiery Showdown, with Joy Behar, it was supposed to be just another typical day on The View, but for Mark Wahlberg, it quickly turned into a confrontation that no one had seen coming. As the cameras rolled and the familiar applause filled the air, Mark Wahlberg entered the set with his signature confidence. His tie was straight, his posture proud, and his smile for the audience was genuine. But there was something in Joy Behar's eyes, something sharp and calculating that sent an instant chill down his spine. Joy, known for her biting sarcasm and political commentary, had been waiting for this moment. The tension between them was palpable, even before Mark had taken his seat. Mark had done interviews with countless journalists, critics, and hosts, but something told him this one would be different. Joy had a reputation for being more than just a talk show host. She was a force of nature, ready to make anyone uncomfortable for the sake of a good soundbite. And today, Mark was her target. "Welcome back to The View." Joy's voice rang out smooth but with an edge. "And today we have the one and only Mark Wahlberg with us." Her smile seemed to stretch a little too wide, too practiced. "Mark, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." Mark smiled politely, trying to stay professional, but something about her tone set off alarms in his head. "Thanks for having me, Joy," he replied, hoping to keep things light. "Always good to be here with you ladies." But Joy's eyes narrowed slightly and her smile took on a sharper, more predatory look. "Oh, is it though?" she shot back, leaning forward with a mocking glint in her eyes. "I seem to remember you having some pretty strong opinions about people in my line of work. Something about actors thinking they're political experts. Ring a bell." The studio audience shifted in their seats, sensing that this wasn't going to be the usual back and forth. Mark's jaw tightened, but he remained composed, refusing to let her bait him into an argument. "I think you might be taking something out of context there, Joy," he said, his voice steady. "But I stand by it. There's a difference between having opinions and talking down to people." "Oh, talking down to people," Joy repeated, her voice dripping with mock concern. "That's rich coming from someone who made a career out of playing the tough guy from the streets." Mark could feel the heat rising in his chest. This was no longer just a simple chat about his latest project, it was turning into a personal attack. He leaned forward, his voice still firm. "I never claimed to be anyone's spokesperson, Joy, but I grew up in Dorchester. I know what it's like to struggle to work multiple jobs just to get by. I didn't grow up in some ivory tower making jokes about real people's problems." Joy's eyes flashed with anger, her nostrils flaring. "Ivory tower," she echoed. "That's what you think this is. I've been working in this business longer than you've been famous, buddy. I've earned my right to have opinions, and I've earned my right to call them out when they're wrong." Mark felt his temper starting to flare, but he fought to keep it under control. "You sit here every day making millions telling people how they should think, how they should vote, how they should live their lives," he said, the frustration evident in his voice. "Meanwhile, the people you're lecturing are trying to figure out how to pay rent." The studio fell silent. Mark's words had struck a chord, and the audience could feel the palpable tension in the air. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting alongside them, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear that this wasn't the lighthearted celebrity interview they were expecting. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for the spotlight, and Mark was not backing down. Joy, however, wasn't backing off either. She leaned back in her chair with a smug smile. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Don't play the victim here, Mark. You're not the spokesperson for the working class. You're a Hollywood actor with an agenda." Mark's voice dropped sharp and direct. "I never said I was anyone's spokesperson, Joy, but I don't sit here every day pretending to know what it's like to struggle. You think because you've been in the business for so long, you have the right to dictate to everyone else? Well, I'm sorry, but that's not how it works." Joy's smile remained, but her eyes now carried a hint of venom. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did I forget that you're the expert on all things working class? Tell me, Mark, when exactly did you become the voice of the people?" Mark's patience was thinning, but he wasn't about to let Joy rattle him. He leaned in, his tone icy but controlled. "You don't get to lecture me about the working class, Joy. You don't get to sit here and talk about struggling when you've never been there yourself. You've made a career out of criticizing people who work hard every day, and I'm not going to sit here and let you attack me for speaking the truth." Joy's eyes narrowed, her expression shifting into something more dangerous. She wasn't going to let this go. So what do you think of my opinions, Mark? Are they wrong? Are you the one who's right and everyone else is just out of touch? She said the last part with a sneer, leaning forward to close the distance between them. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising anger within him. I'm not saying I'm right, Joy, he replied slowly, but I am saying that we need to have a real conversation, not one where we just tear each other down. You sit there every day mocking people who disagree with you, making fun of their beliefs, their values. That's not a conversation. That's just being cruel. Joy's eyes flared, her anger rising. Cruel? She repeated, her voice sharp. You're going to call me cruel. Mark's voice dropped even lower, each word measured. Yeah, I am. Because that's what you're doing, Joy. You're trying to humiliate people for sport. You're not trying to make a difference. You're just trying to be right. The studio audience could feel the heat between them, the palpable clash of egos and beliefs. Whoopi looked uncomfortable, as if trying to figure out how to calm the storm that was clearly brewing. Listen, Mark continued, his voice steady but with a bite. We're not here to have a debate. We're not here to discuss ideas. You want to make this personal. You want to attack me because you don't like what I said. And that's fine, but don't pretend this is about anything else. The silence in the room grew thicker as Joy shot back with a dismissive laugh. Oh, please, Mark, she said coldly. You don't get to come on my show and tell me how to do my job. This is my platform, not yours. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You know what? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You want to make this personal. You want to tear me down for your own amusement. But I'm done here. The camera zoomed in on Mark's face, his jaw clenched with anger. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked towards the exit, the tension in the room building with every step. The producers in the control room were scrambling, unsure of how to handle the situation. The moment had escalated from an interview into a full-blown confrontation. As Mark reached the door, he paused for a moment, turning back to look at Joy. You know what the saddest part is, Joy, he said quietly. You had a chance to have a real conversation today, to show that people with different opinions can still talk to each other with respect, but instead you chose to make it personal. You chose to make me the villain. Well, congratulations. You've just proven everything I said about you. With that, he walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned faces and a host whose career would never be the same. As Mark Wahlberg stormed off the set of The View, the studio erupted into an awkward, strained silence. The applause that once greeted his entrance now seemed like a distant memory replaced by a palpable tension that hung in the air. Whoopi Goldberg, visibly shaken, attempted to regain control of the situation, but the damage was done. Mark had left the set, but the confrontation would not easily be forgotten. Joy Behar, who had moments earlier been sitting in her chair with an air of smug satisfaction, now stared blankly at the audience. Her expression was a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. Mark's words had cut deep. He had called her out in front of millions, and now she found herself scrambling to salvage what remained of her dignity. Well, Whoopi began trying to steer the conversation back on track. I think we should take a quick break. Her voice lacked its usual authority, and the words seemed to fumble out as if she was desperately trying to make sense of what had just happened. But Joy, her pride wounded, waved her off dismissively. No, I want to finish this, she said coldly, her eyes still locked on the exit where Mark had just disappeared. He came here to promote his movie, but let's be real. That wasn't the real reason he was here. The camera zoomed in on Joy's face, the audience sensing her attempt to regain control of the situation. She wasn't going to let Mark's accusations define her. She'd fought too long to make a name for herself to let some tough guy from Boston get the last word. I'm not going to sit here and let him lecture me about who I am, Joy muttered under her breath, though the microphone picked up every word. This is my show. He wanted to come on and talk about his values, so let's talk about his values. Whoopi, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in her seat. Joy, maybe we should just move on, she suggested, glancing at the clock, realizing that this interview had gone way off the rails. The show had planned to discuss Mark's new film, but the conversation had quickly devolved into personal attacks and political debates. This was not the kind of drama The View was known for. No, Joy interjected firmly, her voice gaining strength with every word. Mark wanted to talk about values, so let's talk about values. She turned to the camera, addressing the audience directly. Let's talk about how Mark Wahlberg has made a career playing characters who are tough, who fight the system, who get arrested, who get into trouble. But when it comes to real issues, he's just another Hollywood actor preaching about things he doesn't understand. Her words cut through the air like a knife. Joy was on the attack now, and there was no turning back. But this wasn't the calculated, biting humor that the audience was used to. This was personal, and Mark wasn't there to defend himself anymore. As Mark walked through the backstage area, his mind raced. He had just been ambushed on national television, and no one in the studio had seemed willing to stand up for him. The producers had been silent, probably unsure of how to handle the storm that was unfolding before them. But what bothered Mark the most was how personal everything had gotten. He had come on The View to promote his movie, yes, but also to have an open conversation. Instead, he had been met with hostility accusations and mockery. Joy had attacked his past, his upbringing, his career, and it had nothing to do with the subject at hand. It wasn't about his film, his work, or even his opinions. It was about tearing him down for sport. Mark paused for a moment, staring at his reflection in the dressing room mirror. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just disappointed. Disappointed that a platform like The View had devolved into this. Disappointed that Joy, who had the power to shape the conversation, had instead chosen to use her platform to attack him personally. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled him from his thoughts. It was his publicist who had been watching the chaos unfold from the side. "Mark," she said, her voice hesitant. "That was a lot." Mark turned toward her, his face a mask of frustration. "Yeah, no kidding. She ambushed me. And they let her do it. You saw that right." Whoopi just sat there doing nothing. His publicist nodded, visibly uncomfortable. "I know, Mark, but I mean you can't let her get away with it. You need to fight back. Show them that they can't just walk all over you." Mark took a deep breath, pushing a hand through his hair. "I tried to, but it's clear she wasn't interested in a conversation. She wasn't interested in talking about anything real. She just wanted to tear me apart for her own entertainment." Back on the set, the mood had shifted drastically. Joy Behar was still fuming. She had expected the confrontation with Mark to go differently. She thought she could poke fun, get in a few digs, and maybe even get some laughs at his expense. But Mark had turned the tables on her, and now she was the one on the defensive. "I'm not a bully, I'm just trying to hold him accountable," Joy muttered to herself, pacing back and forth. If he can dish it out, he should be able to take it. But even as she muttered to herself, she knew deep down that this was more than just a debate over values. This was a personal vendetta. She had a history with Hollywood types who tried to act like they were better than everyone else. She had fought tooth and nail to make a career out of her sharp wit, her biting humor, and her candid political commentary. And now Mark Wahlberg, the tough guy from Boston, was sitting there challenging everything she stood for. But Joy wasn't going to back down. She was Joy Behar, the voice of the liberal left, and she would continue to use her platform to speak her truth. It didn't matter who she offended, who she angered. If she was going to make a statement, she was going to make it loud and clear. The following days were a whirlwind. Clips of the confrontation between Joy and Mark Wahlberg went viral across social media, sparking heated debates online. Conservative outlets praised Mark for standing up to Joy, calling out her hypocrisy and mocking her personal attacks. Liberal outlets, on the other hand, criticized him for being defensive and disrespectful to a respected host like Joy. But as the days passed, it became clear that the fallout wasn't just about Mark and Joy anymore. It had become a larger conversation about the role of media, the power dynamics in Hollywood, and the way political debates were being shaped in the public sphere. This wasn't just a celebrity feud, it was a reflection of a deeper division in the country. As Mark reflected on the aftermath of the View interview, he knew that he had made his point. He had stood up for himself when others wouldn't. He had refused to let Joy Behar mock him and tear him down without consequences. And while it hadn't been easy, he knew that sometimes standing up for yourself meant stepping into uncomfortable situations. The battle may have been over, but the conversation it sparked was just beginning. And as Mark Wahlberg continued his journey, he knew he would be ready for whatever came next. As the dust settled from Mark Wahlberg's explosive exit from The View, the conversation around the confrontation only intensified. What was supposed to be a simple movie promotion turned into one of the most talked about moments in daytime television history. The footage of Mark walking off the set, his composure unraveling under Joy Behar's unprovoked attacks, quickly made its way across the internet. The backlash was swift and the reaction was fierce on both sides. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram were flooded with comments, memes, and opinions dissecting every second of the interview. Conservative pundits hailed Mark for standing up to Joy, calling his actions a courageous defense of his principles. Wahlberg calls out Behar's hypocrisy live on The View. One tweet read, "Finally, someone had the guts to stand up to the left-wing bullying For the liberal crowd, however, the narrative was different. Mark Wahlberg doesn't want to face the truth. He's a privileged actor who thinks he's above the conversation, and tweeted one prominent progressive influencer. Joy Behar is right. He's just playing the victim. As the online debate raged on, some began to analyze the situation through a political lens. Was this a simple celebrity feud, or did it reflect deeper societal divisions? Could Mark's fiery defense of his working-class roots be seen as a larger commentary on the growing divide between Hollywood elites and everyday Americans? The conversation spread far beyond the View set. News outlets across the political spectrum latched onto the incident. While conservative media outlets celebrated Mark's defiance, many liberal networks rushed to defend Joy, claiming that Mark had been the one to escalate the situation. Mark Wahlberg was never interested in having an honest conversation, one editorial read. Instead, he resorted to personal attacks when Joy Behar confronted him about his views on working-class issues. Some commentators even argued that the entire confrontation was a strategic move on the part of The View producers. Was it all part of a plan to get attention and boost ratings after all the show had been struggling with declining viewership numbers in recent years? The explosive clash between Joy and Mark had done more to reignite interest in The View than any other recent segment. But for all the media analysis, one thing was certain: Mark had struck a nerve. The confrontation had stirred the pot in a way that only a few other celebrity clashes had. The usual Hollywood talk show banter had turned into something more heated, raw, and personal. While the cameras had stopped rolling, the tension behind the scenes was far from over. As Mark made his way through the backstage area, his publicist met him with a concerned expression. She had been watching the interview unfold from the side, knowing this wasn't going to be just another promotional appearance. "Mark," she said softly, "you did great, but I don't know if I can say the same for the show's producers. I mean, they've been scrambling all afternoon to figure out how to spin this." Mark just shook his head. "It's not about spinning it, it's about honesty. I came on that show to promote my movie, to talk about something real, and what happened, Joy ambushed me with questions that had nothing to do with anything I came there for." I know, his publicist responded, her voice tinged with frustration. "But you have to understand that's the game. The show is more about pushing buttons than having a real conversation. They got what they wanted, Mark controversy." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't mind a little controversy, but when you turn a conversation into a personal attack, that's where I draw the line." His publicist nodded in agreement, but her face remained troubled. "I just hope this doesn't overshadow your movie release. You know how these things can snowball." Mark paused. "If it does, it does. But at least people are talking. And maybe some of them are talking about the things that really matter. Politics, values, respect. I'm fine with that." Meanwhile, back in the studio, the View producers were in full crisis mode. They had never seen an interview unravel so quickly, and they knew the consequences could be severe. The show had always prided itself on its ability to provoke and entertain, but now they had to deal with the fallout of a clash that went far beyond the typical celebrity interview. "The ratings will probably spike," one producer said, trying to reassure the team. "But we need to do some damage control. We need to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." But despite the internal scrambling, it was clear that the damage was done. Joy Behar, for all her years of experience, had let her emotions get the best of her. She had lashed out at Mark not just for his opinions, but for who he was, what he represented. And in doing so, she had turned a promotional segment into an all-out war of words. As the media continued to dissect the fallout, a deeper issue began to emerge. Mark's comments about the working class, his frustrations with the Hollywood elite, resonated with many everyday Americans who felt that their voices weren't being heard in the media. On the other side, Joy's defense of liberal values, of using her platform to speak out against what she saw as the rise of dangerous political ideologies, sparked the ire of many conservatives who felt that the left was becoming more intolerant. For those who followed the political spectrum closely, it was clear that this wasn't just about a celebrity feud. This was the embodiment of the growing divide between two Americas. On one side, you had the working class people who felt ignored, who felt like they were being treated as second class citizens. On the other, you had the liberal elites who seemed to speak for everyone yet dismissed the struggles of those who didn't share their worldview. The real question was what happens when those two worlds collide. In the wake of the interview, public opinion was sharply divided. Polls conducted by major outlets revealed a striking split in reactions to the confrontation. Among conservative audiences, Mark had emerged as a hero. They saw him as someone who had finally taken a stand against the liberal elites who had made it their mission to lecture the rest of the country about values they themselves didn't understand. Among liberal viewers, the sentiment was less sympathetic. Many believed that Mark had come onto The View with a chip on his shoulder, ready to attack Joy for daring to question him. They saw Joy as a defender of progressive values, someone who stood up for the marginalized and the oppressed, while Mark was a privileged celebrity who had forgotten where he came from. But what was perhaps most surprising was the emergence of a middle ground. Many viewers, while siding with neither Joy nor Mark, found themselves disillusioned with the way the conversation had unfolded. The personal attacks, the name-calling, the accusations, it all felt like a game. A game that they, the viewers, weren't interested in playing. "I just wanted to hear about his movie," one viewer tweeted. "Instead, we got a shouting match. It's like the whole thing was just a spectacle for the sake of drama." The confrontation on The View had set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Mark Wahlberg had come to the show with one goal: to promote his film. What he left with was a broken public image of Joy Behar, a heightened sense of polarization in the media, and a conversation that would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. As Mark Wahlberg made his exit from The View, the fallout from the explosive confrontation continued to echo through the media landscape. The cameras had stopped rolling, but the intensity of the moment remained firmly in the spotlight. The show's producers, the guests, and especially Joy Behar, who had launched the attack on Mark, were left to grapple with the aftermath of what had just transpired. The media was in a frenzy, and the story quickly spread across all platforms. News outlets, social media, and even late-night talk shows couldn't resist discussing the fiery exchange. Each outlet had a different take, but one thing was clear: the lines between Hollywood elites and the working class had never been so sharply drawn. Conservative outlets celebrated Mark as a hero. His refusal to sit idly by while being attacked was seen as a stand for free speech and for the forgotten working class. One headline read, "Mark Wahlberg stands up to Hollywood elites, slams Joy Behar for hypocrisy." It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about power dynamics, about the way the media and the elite were seen to dictate the national conversation. On the other hand, liberal news outlets did their best to frame Mark's actions as unprofessional and cowardly. Joy Behar, they argued, had merely asked tough questions, a staple of any good interview. They painted Mark's walk-off as a spoiled celebrity's tantrum in response to being held accountable. The fact that Joy had brought up his past, including his criminal history, was used as justification for her approach. However, it wasn't just the media outlets that were taking sides. Public opinion, too, was sharply divided. Conservatives rallied behind Mark, praising his guts for standing up to a progressive bully on national television. They admired his willingness to expose Joy's brand of divisiveness, which they saw as emblematic of a larger left-wing agenda. Meanwhile, progressive audiences defended Joy, claiming that Mark had not only walked away from a fair challenge, but had resorted to personal attacks when his political views were questioned. He had nothing to say about the issues. It was all about his ego, one Twitter user wrote. As the hours passed, both camps tried to rally their respective supporters. Social media was awash with hashtags, memes, and sound bites from the interview. Mark Wahlberg did right trended on Twitter, while Joy Behar is right saw a surge in followers as well. The bitter clash between these two personalities was now fueling the fire of a much bigger ideological divide in the country. For Joy Behar, the consequences of the confrontation were becoming increasingly clear. The backlash against her wasn't just from conservatives. Even some of her more moderate liberal fans were beginning to question her approach. What had started as a heated debate had spiraled into a personal vendetta that left many viewers uncomfortable. Some began to wonder if this was the beginning of the end for Joy's career. The View had always been a platform for strong opinions, but this particular clash was seen by some as a new low. The show's audience, which had been loyal for years, was divided on whether Joy's aggressive tactics were a reflection of her commitment to progressive causes, or if she had crossed a line in her quest for ratings. Behind the scenes, the View's producers were scrambling to figure out what to do next. The show had gotten the attention it needed, but it had come at a great cost. Would people tune in to see more of the same theatrics, or had they turned off viewers who were tired of the endless political squabbles and personal attacks? For Joy, the fallout from this confrontation could prove to be more damaging than anyone initially anticipated. The public's perception of her as a brash and unyielding host had shifted. No longer was she simply the bold voice of liberal commentary, she had become the face of divisiveness, someone who would rather attack than engage in a meaningful conversation. As the storm raged on, Mark Wahlberg, though embroiled in the chaos, continued to maintain his stance. He had been accused of walking out of the interview because he couldn't handle tough questions, but Mark saw it differently. To him, the conversation had shifted from meaningful discourse to personal attacks, and that he believed was where he drew the line. In a statement released through his publicist, Mark clarified his actions. "I came on The View to talk about my career, to talk about the movie I'm promoting, and to engage in a meaningful conversation. What I didn't expect was to be ambushed with personal attacks, especially when I've always tried to stay focused on the work I do and the issues that matter to me." He went on, "I've always been upfront about where I came from, the mistakes I made, and how I've tried to grow. But that doesn't give anyone the right to tear me down for something that happened years ago. I'm not here to apologize for my past. I'm here to make a difference in the present and future." Mark's statement was well received by many of his fans who admired his ability to stand his ground and not allow himself to be painted as a villain by Joy. But the media continued to pounce, questioning his sincerity and motives. To them, it was all a publicity stunt, a way for Mark to deflect attention from the issues he didn't want to talk about. However, for those who had witnessed the interview, it was clear that Mark was not backing down. His message wasn't just about protecting his image. It was about pushing back against the way political discourse had devolved into personal attacks and gotcha moments. The clash between Mark Wahlberg and Joy Behar had become a microcosm of the larger cultural divide in the United States. On one hand, you had Mark representing the working class values and a desire to return to civil discourse. On the other, you had Joy, who represented the progressive left and their increasingly combative tactics in the public sphere. The question remained what happens when the nation's values and ideologies collide so violently. Was this confrontation just a blip, a moment of heightened emotions that would soon be forgotten? Or was it a reflection of the political polarization that had gripped the country for years? For now, only time would tell. The fallout from the Mark Wahlberg-Joy Behar confrontation continued to unfold, with every side digging in their heels. The divide between the left and right was more visible than ever, with each group using the incident as a symbol of the larger cultural and political battles that raged across the nation. As the dust settled, Mark Wahlberg had solidified his position as a figure unafraid to stand up for his principles, even if it meant walking off The View. The conversation, however, was far from over. The real question was, would this encounter be remembered as a watershed moment in the battle over the nation's soul, or would it simply be forgotten as another celebrity spat in the annals of daytime television history? Only time would tell.